The way I think about architecture and I think its relationship to culture and society is through how these spaces and places continue to question and define much of our contemporary built world. I grew up in Levittown in New York City, outside of New York City, and continue to be motivated very much by the challenge that those kinds of more recent environments and urban phenomena create for us. This approach colors how I think and how the studio thinks about our work in respect to issues of urban life and, importantly, social or public space, and what role architecture has in that equation, and mediating those contexts and the conflicts they produce productively. In my work, I'm constantly and continuously exploring how these issues are experienced by the user or the inhabitant, the participant, through the tools and devices and actions like movement and physical and visual perception. The very first project that, as a studio, as an office, I was ever involved in is a project called Inner City Arts. Can they dim the lights a little bit more? I'm just trying to get something. All right, anyways. Can you see that? It's okay. Which is a project for an art school. It was originally started for very young children, and is a project that is a public and private collaboration between LAUSD and this nonprofit organization to take children who did not, after Proposition 13, have any more arts in their classroom, and to try to bring it back to them in some form. The kids come to this school as opposed to the programs being in the school. What was important was that the project was not developed as an idea about trying to produce artists. The project was an attempt to try to find a series of tools to create stronger senses of bridges between the children, their experiences in downtown Los Angeles, and academics. This project is located really in the heart of Skid Row, and while it is adjacent to downtown, in many ways couldn't be farther from that area. It's a multi-phase project. We've been working on it for a long time. The very original project was a small renovation in a small building in a courtyard that created the majority of different spaces for the arts. In a sense, it was organized as a kind of small microcosm of the city. It was really intended to be seen as a series of individual buildings in what was more of a campus setting, both inside and outside the campus. The goal there was to try to produce potentially an equivalent for that constituency, mostly the kids, but their teachers and their parents as well, that was equivalent to the city, where you could begin to imagine a series of individual disciplines acting very similar to a series of individual cultures within an urban organization or urban organism, but which had to find ways, in a sense, to produce a more comprehensive, cohesive culture out of those multiple and very heterogeneous parts. I was critical of the first phase. That's not why I'm not showing any images of it, but I was critical of the first phase because, in a sense, the project, while creating more of an internal oasis, and as strong as that might have been in terms of sending a signal about what that project was about, also felt disconnected from the city around it. And that was, in many ways, in direct response to a problematic in that context, which was a social problematic about security. And in the later phases, as we continue to expand the campus, we've just finished the third phase, I started to look at ways that you could begin to try to understand the project's responsibility as a larger organism in the city, that it had real responsibility not only to itself, but to the city around it, and began to look for ways to open up or to begin to crack open views and openings into the campus, so that while the building still acted in some ways like a fabric, it began to pull apart, delaminate, be cut apart, so that the inside of that campus had a very strong visual and physical connection to the outside. In that way, what was happening inside was just as important to the day in, day out scene and pace and temporality of the city around it. This is one of the spaces on the inside, a ceramics building, which you see not only from those entries into the project, but also from the roof level, where there's parking. One of the pieces was an existing parking on the roof. The library, one of the studios in one piece of the existing building, and then the exterior. I'd say that in this project, one of the things at Inner City Arts that we were trying to propose was a new way of thinking about context. That context was not necessarily meant to be something that was mimicked. It didn't necessarily mean that there was equivalent materials, but very much the form of the building, the gestures of the building, both internally, externally, related to the city. But I think even more importantly, the most radical thing that we probably proposed here, and I think also the most progressive thing, was to make the entire building, the entire campus white, in a context in which that kind of purity absolutely does not exist. And not only doesn't exist, but in many ways is threatened by the intensity of the urban context. We set as the goal that if Inner City Arts had in fact continued, or was in fact continuing, to have a relationship with the community around it, in which they felt that Inner City Arts had become really an icon of potential and optimism in that neighborhood, that you could try to produce something that had the color of optimism itself, the lightness of optimism, and that the experiment was whether it could remain, in a sense, untouched and kept by the community as a whole, not just the school. And after a year, we've had no problems, no graffiti, no damage to the building. I think also taught us very much about, in one case, the scale of intervention in a city, scale being a very important, I think, urban idea. Very often we think of urbanism at a very large or extreme scale, but at times we don't necessarily consider the scale of influence on a particular intervention on its surrounding context in the city as a whole, and I'll touch on that in a minute again. I think thinking about, I mentioned that I had grown up in Levittown. I don't think my house is on the left-hand side, but it might have been. Thinking about issues of public and social space in a place like Los Angeles, in the beginning of our work, was made much more complex, given that such a large proportion of these types of cities are not public in any traditional way. They're made up really much more of a carpet of single-family houses, private houses, with sometimes disconnected and internalized lives. But in the beginning, most of the projects that we received were houses like many architects. And I've continued to approach them more as distillations or microcosms of a larger or more complex social organization. Many of these projects are trying to demonstrate the urban intention of creating a more fluid overlapping between normally discrete programmatic spaces or roles. It's an effort to look at ways that distinctions like public and private, city and house, can coexist, at times reproducing hierarchies and mechanisms usually associated more with urban typologies than specifically with the house. And we've just completed a project in La Crescenta for the painters Larry Pittman and Roy Dowell, which is adjacent to, this is the Cyrulnik house, which is an early Neutra house that he built for his assistant's husband. It's a classic Neutra from that mid-century period of time, which you can see here up on the hill. The site is about approximately 20 acres of land which at the time that Neutra built this house for his assistant was in the middle, for the most part, of nowhere, overlooking the valley where the sprawl had not caught up with that part of the city yet, and backed up to the Angeles Crest National Forest. So it was in a sense really at the threshold between these two defining landscapes in Los Angeles, that of the mountains and that kind of ruggedness, and the sprawl of what emerged as the remainder of the city. When Neutra built the house, maybe because he knew his assistant was working for an architect, he imagined that she didn't or wouldn't have much money in the future. And he convinced them in this larger piece of property to cut 2 additional flat pads on the site, with the idea that eventually, if they ever did need money, they could subdivide the property. They never did. They never did subdivide the property, and those pieces of property, for the most part, remained until Larry and Roy bought the site. They eventually turned this lower portion into a succulent garden, which in this Google map doesn't show up, but it's a kind of extraordinary, iconic garden on its own. This site had nothing on it. You come to the site along this long serpentine driveway, eventually ending up at the Neutra house. This is the site of our house, which will become is becoming their main house, the Neutra house being more guest house and library. In working on this project and thinking about how the house in many ways is a distillation or potentially an equivalent to urban ideas as opposed to particularly suburban ideas. I was interested in the problem of transparency in our contemporary life. The Neutra house is one of those perfect romantic versions of modernist transparency. This idea that we are completely connected to the context around us, that the walls are in a sense non-existent, and we have a one-to-one relationship with the outside, which at the time I think was a phenomenal, very beautiful and compelling idea. As our lives have become much more transparent, however, culturally and socially to the world as a whole, that idea of incredible transparency in our private lives is potentially no longer as compelling, and potentially you could almost imagine it having more sinister qualities, which was really the argument, the conversation that I and the clients entered into. That this intense level of connectivity all of this time produced a new condition, that of simultaneity. I was trying to imagine how then that condition could potentially be how you would examine that in more positive ways. Around that time, I got interested from a design standpoint in these puzzles called mathematical dissections. They're games that mathematicians do, I guess, in their spare time when they're not doing anything else, where you take a platonic form, an even-sided form, and you begin to dissect it geometrically, and by recombining it in a puzzle-like way, you create other even-sided forms. And that was interesting to me because, in a sense, you could begin to imagine, just in that idea metaphorically, that it was almost as if you were taking the Neutra house in that rectangle with its transparency at the perimeter, cutting it apart and flipping it. So now the internal, more privatized life was creating the exterior perimeter, and that hyper-transparency, that intense simultaneity, was more on the inside. The house is a 7-sided house, which has a great deal to do with your movement up and around and in the house on that road. But here in the plan, you begin to see on the right-hand side that geometry from those dissections quite literally becoming the separations between these spaces. Not so much really a series of more traditional walls, but really much more intensely a series of perspectival spaces that seem to connect across the glass walls, connecting one space to another. The house has, we were asked by the client not to have any doors, we realized we had to have at least two. There's one on the outside, and there's one in the bathroom. The rest of these are more windows and closet doors. But that had a lot to do with their ambition to somehow get beyond the house as a completely functional idea as it related to lifestyle. It was a conversation that they continued to reinforce, that they were trying to get past the Catholicism of function. You can see a model here. You can move around the house in a more or less circular way, clockwise fashion, but you can also move across those lines at the same time, short-circuiting that major movement in the house. The plan quite literally becomes the geometry of the roof. And because this is a view from the Neutra house, because this house is slightly below the Neutra house, there's always been, in our mind, a very important relationship, maybe a more primary relationship, to the view of the roof down to the house than necessarily from the more typical facades. And here you see two important moments, which I'll mention: this skylight and this moment of the courtyard. View of the exterior of the house. And those, while there is very much a procession, a kind of promenade in the house, the sense that whether you're on the exterior or the interior, you're in a kind of constant state of motion, and that the house very much is trying to give you the sense that it's in some kind of rotation on the site itself, that there are moments in the house where you are deeply connected to the iconography of the context around. And in one case, there's a very important stone pine, which is at the border between the Neutra house and the new house. And there are moments where the geometry, either in the elliptical skylight window or the geometry of the courtyard, that lock very directly into those iconic points. I mentioned the internal quality of the house, exploring ideas of a more simultaneous series of spaces. These were early renderings. These are some images of the house as it's been built. That position between, in some ways, that position between the ruggedness of the mountains and what we consider the banality of the urban landscape below, I think very often betrays the sense that those thresholds in a city like Los Angeles are still extremely intense and are still thresholds that very much define the characteristics of our city. And we were about 6 hours away from losing the house in the previous fires. We've been involved in an ongoing project with Skid Row Housing Trust in downtown Los Angeles to reimagine the form of housing in this part of Los Angeles. And in a sense, one of the ongoing speculations that we are involved in is not only how does the house characterize the city in a place like Los Angeles, but as the city is changing and becoming denser and denser, how multifamily housing might in fact be doing a very similar thing as it relates to the future of this and other cities. I think you can make an argument that Los Angeles is very much maybe one of the most important problems and challenges that this city has as we begin to look at its future is the question of density. Many cities deal with that. Density is a common trope almost of the idea of urbanism. But here, I think it presents a much more particular problem in a city like Los Angeles, which has been defined by the potential for a kind of endless sprawl, a kind of endless expansion. And within that, I think, has been written into the psychological DNA of the city, an idea about almost a manifest destiny, that somehow the city was always defined by the potential of growing and never had to confront the city that, in a sense, it had previously made. We were able to constantly move those boundaries out. Now, in many ways, maybe not physically, but I think psychologically, those boundaries have been defined. Those boundaries have been met. The city, in a sense, has grown to its capacity to hold itself as one conceptual entity. That is, I think, conditioning this question about density in the city, where it's important for us to begin to not think about density in a conventional way, but to begin to imagine what kind of implications, what kind of forms might that have for a city that does not necessarily relate to traditional urban precedents in a very strong way. So in that sense, in the face of density, can housing redefine Los Angeles? One way that we've begun to think about that is that urbanistically, potentially, one transformational idea might not be to produce scale and size of intervention by taking over enormous parts of the city, but that potentially you could begin to think about a much more iterative strategy of smaller projects that over time creates a new map, rebalances the map of the city, and creates a new kind of overwritten palimpsest of understanding for the city that changes the way that we think about density and urbanity in the city. One of the first projects for Skid Row Housing Trust was Rainbow Apartments, which is literally really right at the crossroads of the most intense homeless population in the city. You can see that what we think of as the city is never far from view. These are projects that are permanent supportive housing for their tenants. If you find a way to get an apartment in these buildings, you can be here for the rest of your life. So there's a real sense that community grows in these buildings, as well as these buildings not having a transitional or transitory quality in the city, but really sponsor a great deal more permanence. The second project, which we've just finished, takes that model that Rainbow started of a building that has both a strong presence on the exterior, but also produces a much stronger internal context for its tenants, and does that in a place that's in some ways unlikely, not on Skid Row, but immediately adjacent to the 10 freeway. Here you see the Staples Center, and we're over here tonight. It's very much a visible project, taking what has, up until now, been a problem that has very much been hidden from the city and making it much more apparent, much more front and center. The building is in plan a circle that has some certainly to do with the sense of movement and the apprehension of the building as you move in and around the project. It has a very technical concern, which has to do with the acoustics of the site, which are horrendous, as you might imagine, being about 18 feet away from an off-ramp on the 10 freeway. That round shape begins to produce certain acoustical qualities which are beneficial. The project is, though, a building that has three major ideas to it. One, which has to do with its connection to the ground plane and the urban environment in and around it, which is really characterized by the freeway and the underpass of the freeway. Secondly is the form and the internal courtyard as you move up through it. And then the third is how those two become much more related to each other. At the lowest level, the plan is distinct from the plan of the apartments up above. It's a plan which has a series of passageways and views in and through that extend certain perspectives underneath the highway, down down Hope Street to the building, across some of the more minor buildings, including the alleyways, And within this lower level, which houses many of the social services, the entry room, community space, community garden, those spaces are very much seen as being connected formally, visually to that lower level. And the concrete of the highway in many ways becomes the form and material of the lower level. Get a view from one of the community rooms. As the building begins to rise out of that, the form changes quite radically as it relates to this center courtyard, and the apartments are organized as a spiraling, almost shell-like unfolding that begins to open up to the city and creates a much stronger presence, formal presence on the Hope Street corner. But it also produces very small and important gestures that include beginning to create a stronger sense of presence and individuality for each of the apartments. These are very small efficiency units. Most of the social services, each one has a small kitchen, and bathroom, and bedroom. But most of the other common services are up in the building. In Rainbow, those pieces of program, those social components of the program, were primarily on the ground floor. But here, those programs begin to quite literally spiral up through the building, creating almost a telescopic effect out to the city beyond, so that as you move from space to space, you're not just moving through the building, but you're beginning to develop a different sense, a different set of perspectives out to that surrounding complex. This is the inside of the courtyard. These photographs are just as it was done before it was occupied, with the exception of the opening party. The view up. And then one of those spaces I was talking about, in this case, less programmatic. This is the Smoking Porch, which has one of the most extraordinary views, $1 million views of downtown that you can possibly imagine. We're in the design process for a third project. The Rainbow Apartments is here. There's actually a Koenig Eisenberg building, the Abbey Apartments, which was finished recently. This is one of the main police stations. Much of this portion of the toy garment district, Skid Row of downtown, is marked by these single-story buildings, parking on the top, and retail on the ground floor. In this project, the Star Apartments, we have been looking with the client to try to begin to produce a building that was not just about the apartments and the social services, but also had other functions that were more a part of the city, to really create a multifunctional building that might have commercial space in it, retail space, shops, restaurants in the building. But like a lot of these projects, it's not just an architectural goal or an urban goal. There's also very much a political and jurisdictional set of hurdles that you need to cross. And in the housing department, where some of the money comes from these projects, you're not allowed to have retail uses in your buildings. I think the idea being that you're in the housing business, you're not in the shopping business, you're not in the retail business. But there's a loophole, if you look closely, which says if there's an existing commercial use on the site, you can keep it. And so Skid Row Housing Trust went out and scoured Skid Row to find a building that was for sale that had existing retail uses, which we found on this site. This is what it looks like. And we're going to keep it. It'll look different than this when we're done. But it's, again, that typical kind of building which has retail on the ground floor, concrete podium, concrete slab, and parking up above. This is the new design, where we're keeping the retail component, obviously remaking that facade, but because it needs, for the most part, to be kept intact during construction, the building is lifted up above this new datum of that upper deck and needles its way through structurally that lower podium. What that begins to do, as opposed to the other models where we were looking at buildings that were really surrounding a courtyard at the center where most of those services were on. In fact, you begin to get a layering of urban experience in this building, which is marked by this lower retail space and entries to the building, an upper level which becomes a series of social spaces that include the meeting rooms, the cooking facility, common kitchens, gardens on the outside, running tracks, exercise spaces, and then the apartments are created on this additional deck, which is lifted in the air. This is a plan of that concourse, some of these drawings. One of the difficulties in building this building is to do it in such a constrained site. This project we are producing this building so that the apartments are being built in a prefabricated way, which will be the first multifamily prefabricated building that the city has permitted in a maybe ever. It's been a long process. The goal here certainly is to produce a building which is less expensive, but not because prefabrication is less expensive, but because of the amount of time working in this in the city, the speed with which you can build the building. It should take about 6 months from the point of the deck, build the remainder of the building. But it also allows us to provide a much higher level of quality to these different units in the building. And here you begin to see a series of terraces which become much more privatized internal courtyards. As we've begun to work outside of the city, I've increasingly been aware that the use of the term context and what it means for architecture, what it's certainly meant for the history of architecture, especially in the city, doesn't necessarily fit anymore in describing what I'm interested in, what we're focused on. But rather, I'd say it's an interest in understanding the existence of characteristics as opposed to context characteristics. Perhaps thinking about this as a way of inquiry in the city is more abstract, potentially at times more ambient, ephemeral in its qualities of building, space, and experience. But arriving at this point has been important for us because it imagines how you might be able to begin to understand more propelling aspects of a given project situation that, while resisting many of the easier categorizations that more traditional forms of context produce, is no less tangible. Paradoxically, I'd say that I'm looking to the design to develop its qualities and instincts through such a deep commitment to the inherent characteristics of the existing site or situation that your understanding is ultimately somehow liberated from it. Not really so much a transformation urbanistically, but rather a kind of transposition of both the body and the mind. And here I think it's one of the keys to understanding the intensities and the forms of our work, that one's understanding of the structure, the form, and the experience of a place is renegotiated by the extraordinariness of your position and the position that the architecture produces and allows you to be in. That the viewer, the audience, the building viewer, the building goer is in a real and deep and involved relationship with the building and its surrounding site by the kind of armature of experience that the building creates. We were invited to a competition for a new headquarters building for Pirelli Corporation in Milan, just outside of the core of the city, in an area called the Bacocca. We won the competition, and then they told us we didn't win. And then they said, no, in fact, you did win. And then they said, no, you have to partner with somebody else. And then they said that they won. And then they said, no, in fact, we'll give it to you. And then there was a huge scandal between Pirelli and Italian Telecom, and now we're not sure if anybody has it or what's happening, which seems to be par for the course working in Milan from what I understand. But this project was a project to develop a headquarters building on a site that had originally been their factory site, enormous zone in the city that, like a lot of corporations, had changed use when most of those manufacturing processes had been moved overseas. And Pirelli, in many ways, in Italy, had become more of a developer, a landholding company. And in this enormous site, in the middle of Milan, one of the centers of really the ongoing, certainly over history, discourse and conversation and argument about what urbanism is and certainly what modernism's role is in that, Pirelli decided to build in all of their buildings an American version of big box suburbanism, which is marked by all of the same kinds of buildings that we would see in the suburbs of any American city, including Target, Best Buy, Toys R Us, and a multiplex, 8 theaters out on this edge. The Via Sarca is an important 19th century street in the city, along which one side is a very intact 19th century grid-like portion of Milan. And that continues around these two sides of the city, sites of the city as well. The building that we designed was meant to originally, the program brief said that it was meant to be on this site. But instead, we broke the building really into 2 distinct forms, which had some development importance as well, because it allowed Pirelli to, in a sense, think about how they would lease the building in 2 different ways. But more importantly, it was trying to create a building that was in some ways both fabric and object, that was both urban and suburban at the same time. But in doing that, creating a building which in many ways stood as an object out on that important street, but then was stretched or pulled, delaminated and stretched across with its other tower to begin to create a kind of parasitical relationship to the theater, that it was really the head of all of these other developments. And that in that way, the building wasn't one or the other, wasn't particularly urban in a traditional way, wasn't suburban in the form of the rest of the context, but was something new, something that was both and. And in that stretching, created a new form of the bridge suspended at the mid-level that created a kind of gateway into the building, into the site. Working with Arup in Los Angeles, the structure of the building started to evolve into what really became a kind of X-brace that was 3-dimensional, almost like a space frame. It had real advantages in terms of how the building was supported primarily in a tensile way. But it also had the benefit of beginning to clear out in both of the 2 rectangular buildings the middle floor. And that's where the bridges connected. Those 3-dimensional X-braces, those space frame braces, created smaller atriums that wrap up through the building, which from a sustainability standpoint allowed fresh air to be taken through the building and exhausted up into the building, created glass visible connections from floor to floor to create a greater amount of visual connection and connectivity in the building socially. The bridge is where all of the conference rooms, cafe, daycare center were pulled out of the rest of the building and brought into that one floor. So as opposed to trying to find a way to invigorate a ground plane in a traditional way, which didn't exist, we were trying to create a new kind of urbanism lifted up in the middle of the building, which became very much the iconic center of the building. The facade, as it wraps around the building, is an important part of the iconography of the building as a performative facade. Was developed digitally to seem, as you moved around the building, to open and close, was certainly directed to the solar orientations over the course of the year, so that the facade at times closed itself off to the angle of the sun, at other times opened up and created a series of light shelves to bounce daylight very deeply into the building, and also act as a kind of damper system around the outside of the building, where these forms were all connected in relationship, structural relationship to that X-brace, that X-frame. That idea of a kind of vertical urbanism is an idea that we're exploring in a project for Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a new headquarters building for JPL in La Crescenta. Jet Propulsion Laboratory is a campus-like environment on the edge as well of the mountains. I don't have a fire picture of this one, but it came about that close as well. Seems to be an epidemic in our projects. The new building is here at the entry to the campus. The watershed, the Hahamonga watershed, is at this point of the campus. The new building, as headquarters, has within it 5 different directorates and then some additional departments. The problem that Jet Propulsion Laboratory has is that as a deeply collaborative and creative culture on the lab as a whole, they are looking to try to produce a similar level, a similar type of culture in the headquarters building. The headquarters building is a rat's nest of politics right now, where each of the different departments and different directorates are extremely separate, marginally collaborative. And in this building, one of the stated ambitions was to try to produce a building that would have a higher level of deep connection within those departments. One of the problems, however, is that the form of their buildings, and it's something that has to be produced in this building as well, is a very suburban model of individual offices. Each of the directors, each of the researchers has their own individual office with very little connection amongst each other. We were looking at exploring in a number of models, but as we started to develop the design, we began to think of the building as really being a stack, not so much of a building that sat around a larger atrium that was commonly shared with everybody, but a building in which the offices were densely gathered, and that by stacking them started to create a series of smaller, more discrete common spaces that moved up, spiraled up through the building as a whole. And on the inside of the building, that those spaces would become in many ways the most important characteristic, the most defining characteristic of the building. In a sense, the real formal intensity was not so much on the exterior of the building, but very much on the inside of the building. And each of those courtyards, which you'll see some images in a minute, become very different, very particular landscapes, most of them being outdoors, each of them having a very specific chromatic coloration, and that chroma, that quality of color on the inside of the building begins to leach out to the exterior facade, and in this quite repetitive punched facade creates a more abstract, more discrete understanding of program on the outside of the facade. Not so much the modernist idea of absolutely describing program in a singular way to and telegraphing that to the exterior facade, but more a sense of the atmospherics of that space percolating to that outside. I mentioned that these spaces happen through the building all the way up. There's one on that side along the ground plane, and the section begins to show how those spaces are interconnected. The ground floor is one singular continuation of the exterior, with the building hovering up above you. And as you move up, you begin to enter these different exterior landscapes, of which this is one of them, that again have a quite abstract topography and singularity to almost a monoculture to their planting. That project and the idea that landscape in many ways could begin to could be the ground for thinking about social and public space, urbanistic space, is something that we've been interested in for quite a while. And absolutely, you can see that the relationship of things like landscape to architecture and to urbanism is creating a great deal of blurring, both in the forms of those disciplines as well as in the forms of their projects too. We're doing a landscape project, actually a landscape here at the very end of Playa Vista on the west side of the city. This is the original, this is the wetlands. This is, as many of you probably know, very contentious area that is a kind of new urbanist development, mostly housing. And this is the area that was under a lot of political contention. As you get up into this area where the Spruce Goose Hangar is, this area is less contentious, is all meant to be office buildings, speculative office buildings, development office buildings, and our landscape is at the center. A number of years, Herbert Mouchamp, the architectural critic at the New York Times, wrote a piece where he was deeply critical of an emerging urbanism, or an idea about urbanism as it related to the cities in terms of how cities were more and more being given over, were becoming less and less public. We're being given over more and more to privatized and development concerns and enterprise. And he had a great anxiety about that, that those spaces were in many ways becoming deeply, they were becoming filled because of those enterprises' fears and anxieties about empty space. That they were becoming filled with activities in such a way that there was a kind of cacophony of competing interests that didn't necessarily allow for the kind of, in a sense, empty space that at one point marked a real alternative to the density of most cities. And here I want to make the distinction between empty space or I think he made the distinction between empty space and open space. I agree to a large extent with that, and I think that especially when you look at the qualities of American urbanism and American space, the idea of empty space is an important concept. But at Playa, we were interested in whether it wasn't so much a question of empty, open, or dense, but possibly it was a question of how space like this was urban or not, and that activity could be used in many different ways in the service of what that question of urbanism might in fact be. At Playa, you can see there the beginnings of these buildings around. These buildings have just been finished. They're by Gensler. some buildings on this side which are still in early design. As opposed to creating one larger open space, instead we developed a park that was really a series of what appear to be bridges across a more continuous waterway, with these bridges, each one having a very specific activity or being defined very much by a specific activity. In some ways, you could almost think of it as a kind of bento box of different activities on the landscape. But the idea was that by accumulating so many of these different opportunities, that where the real urbanism came into play was not in any one of the specific activities, but in its temporal quality over the course of the day. What I mean by that is that you could begin to imagine, you're meant to imagine that different itineraries might take place in very different ways, using each of these different activity zones to make up what would be a more full and comprehensive experience over the course of a day, a week, and eventually a year. This is one of those spaces, the Quartz Bridge. And I should say, this is green space lawn sports bridge. One of them is soccer. The other two are slightly depressed lawn areas where we've made up the games. The second bridge is basketball, sand volleyball, and children's playground. Another is a large amphitheater with outdoor amphitheater space with band shell. Small activities, Bosque, with a series of smaller court activities. Horticultural gardens, which are meant to be a place where horticultural classes take place. And this is the Wi-Fi bridge on that side, which is meant for outdoor meetings. I think it's mostly going to become the dating bridge. This is the amphitheater. You can see the amphitheater in the design. These were a number of models of the form of the amphitheater, which takes the structure and appears to attach it to the ground only at a singular point. So it begins to feel like a top spinning on that, or maybe like a top spinning on the performance platform. It's a fabric skin, and we were trying to get rid of this ring, which you can see more in this model, so that the form of the entire structure becomes more three-dimensional, especially at the center point. One, to give it structural rigidity, but to also produce more texture in the fabric, more three-dimensionality along that band. They're in the process of building the amphitheater space. It's a little further along than that. The park is almost done, not quite. Here you begin to see some of the spaces. Much of the planting doesn't exist, but I think it does begin to give you a sense of the repetition of these separate activity areas. The water was not in at that point. It's beginning to be put in here. The water is a part of a larger groundwater remediation process. This is the kids' playground. The water comes up to here, so it begins to fill around some of the trees. The bermed gardens, which have a relationship, obviously, to the mountain above. And then the last two things I wanted to talk about. One is an ongoing project at San Francisco State University, which is a gateway building to the campus as a whole. It's a performing arts complex. San Francisco State University has a very large performing theater and broadcast arts discipline on the campus. The project is enormous. It's almost 300,000 square feet. It has 5 theaters, the largest, which is a 1,200-seat opera theater, a 450-seat, what they call the Little Theater, theatrical space, 300-seat music recital space, 200-seat black box theater, and then a small lunchtime impromptu theater of about 50 people, as well as multiple classrooms, scene shops, prop shops, practice rooms. in a lot of ways, it really is a city in and of itself. You can see here, this is the street that leads to and from San Francisco, so this is very much the gateway into this larger context of the campus, and then the landscape of the park on that side. It really was the intention here. It's not so much that SFSU is a building or a landscape project per se, but instead really an idea of a relationship between between the urban and the landscape, more in potentially the tradition of the Venice Hospital or other modernist mat buildings. But here, I think one of the important developments is really the role of section as it relates to not just the singular horizontal mat, but really the multiplication of a series of landscapes, a series of mats, a series of topographies that are laid one on top of each other and begin to create significant levels of periodic density throughout the campus. This is the lower level of the model. I'm not going to get into this project programmatically, with the exception to say that you begin to see some of these spaces, the larger 1,200-seat theater, the 450-seat theater is here, the music recital hall, and also a way in which exterior space and the campus as a whole begins to be more interwoven with the plan of the building as a whole. I think this model begins to really show the intense complexity of the interior. This is the 1,200-seat theater, where that sense of interconnection and weaving together these disparate constituencies that make up the Creative Arts Center as a whole find their form very much as well in some of the internal spaces. And in a completely different way, the music recital hall is a space which is not so much looking to itself internally to create a level of intimacy in the way many theaters do, but instead is made up of a space, is created with a space that at each of the corners, which are less important acoustically, that the space in fact does not look inward, is not completed inwardly, but in a sense the space begins to open out and connect to the different parts of the larger complex, so that as you move through the building, when there are not performances or recitals happening in the space, you're quite literally moving through, for instance, this performance space, creating the equivalent of moving through a kind of small town or city square. The design of the center is really marked by, as I mentioned, a series of these levels, but there is one iconic datum floor which extends throughout the building. It's really not only a spatial datum, but really serves as a type of mixing floor for interaction and collaboration between all of the students, the faculty, the visiting professionals, the larger campus. No matter where you move in the building, you always arrive on that datum. And lastly, I wanted to finish with a project that was a competition that we were recently involved in, as well as the dean was involved in. Neither one of us won. We're both still very angry about it. It's normally when we have the potential to have a drink together, we start talking about. In a city, Shenzhen, in many ways in this project, in a completely different context from some of the ones that I've been talking about, we began to develop a building, I think, in this competition that's testing the amalgam of ideas that I might have touched on tonight in one building. A building that in many ways has to deal with both the horizontality of the site, the park on the other side, the sense that that landscape should, in some ways, move more seamlessly to the inside of this courtyard of extraordinary scale that's defined by these existing towers, residential and office towers, that surround almost like a series of paternal jurors, the site that we were involved in. The building, as a form, I think begins to show its anxiety about what, in fact, it actually is. Is it a tower, a mid-rise, a landscape building, a low-rise building? Is it a building that has a front, has a back, relates to or creates a more comprehensive and traditional street wall, or is really an object at the scale of other objects around the phenomenal scale that's being produced in Shenzhen? Also deals with much of the complexity of a building like San Francisco State University, but tries to imagine how that can be done vertically. This is a small sketch that really was just talking about a series of diagonals that are really created in and around the site and through the building to start to produce real visual connection inside and outside the building to its context and internal components. This is a map of the different functions in the building, including many exhibition spaces, office spaces, and some theaters, which are close to being as large as the Opera Theater I showed you in San Francisco State University. That theater for us in our building was in the tower. But all of these spaces, all of this intense and diverse program, which is stacked in that diagram, as I was mentioning, and cloaked or clothed in a somewhat slippery skin, a skin that tries to, in many ways, take on very different personalities as it lays over the programmatic massing of the building. Also, through the entire building, has one important skewer-like diagonal set of stairs, which forms a continuous atrium-like, diagonal atrium-like space that extends through the entire building. Connects all the levels, all the program, and creates an atrium that you don't look into in the traditional sense of atrium, but becomes really a center of activity, in a sense more so than even the programmatic elements of the building itself. It becomes really, I think, arguably the identity of the building through that level of activity. This is looking down into the building. And I think, similar to many of the other speculative blurrings tonight about city, house, building, landscape, space, and form, in this building, I think one of the real complexities is the role, in some ways, of the street versus the building in an urbanistic situation. And in this way, that interior space, as it runs up through the building, becomes the equivalent of a kind of, or has the kind of quality of street in terms of its activity, its presence, its informality, its uncontrollability in the program. And there, I think, is one of the last questions tonight. Is in an urban situation, is the city and the iconography of the city building, or is the iconography of the city finally street? And most importantly, how does that ongoing debate relate to, as well as these other potential speculations, relate to work in the contemporary city. The topic certainly that I hope to continue to test very much over the course of the semester. Thank you very much.
Questions? Comments?
Michael, are you giving up to a certain extent on the kind of ground plane in these larger projects? It seems this kind of emphasis on the kind of importance of the upper level grids and connections and the drawing up of the activities into the building. Is that the kind of dichotomy between public space and security? Is it because?
Well, what I no, I don't think I am giving up on that. One, but I do think that the way that we're dealing with that space has evolved quite a bit from the way that we dealt with that kind of space much earlier in our work. And what I mean by that is that when in a lot of my earlier work, I was very interested in the way that that public space was closely linked to an idea about procession, promenade, and movement, which relates obviously to landscape as well, but has been a trope that's been explored, an idea that's been explored in modernism over the course of its development. But over time, and that kind of movement was very important for the way that it really animated a series of relationships and the public space in many of our buildings. But over time, and I think in many ways over the last 10 years, since our thinking about the city has continued to change and become more difficult with issues like security, control, surveillance, I became much more suspicious of our work, much more critical of our work as being overly controlling of that experience, that the movement to the building, that idea of what was public, was in a sense being choreographed to such an extent by us that I think you could make the argument that we were over-manipulating that experience. More recently, in the later work, I've become, and I think maybe this relates some to what Herbert was asking for, but I maybe didn't do such a good job touching on that in all of the projects, is that that ground plane now for us has often in these projects become much more open and in a way less specific and to less hierarchical in terms of the way that you might be able to move through that space. In a sense, we're trying to produce a space that is more ecumenical to many users. That there's more possibility for the impromptu, again, the informal, and the public to take place. So what you're seeing in those buildings is not so much a denial of the ground plane, although activity is increasingly being brought up into very, very deeply into the building. I would say that one, that's about trying to draw the public activity that was generally resided on the ground plane or in the street more deeply into the building, but also to allow for a greater sense of uncontrolled possibility in those ground planes, in that ground space.
You have to be an optimist, though.
I don't know how you do what any of us do without being an optimist. Oh, Dana, I'll come back to you in a second.
I was wondering if you could speak to the negotiation prioritization between form finding and weight finding in your projects.
Tell me a little bit more about what you mean.
Oh, what?
About what you mean.
Well, it seems like in your projects, you have this great wealth of interesting spaces, but I worry, as a user, that you get lost or something because
you sound like one of our clients, actually. That, of course, is always a possibility, and I think that's, as an architect, I think that's something that one needs to be deeply conscious of. I believe that in our work, I've found in our work that in fact we have been able, in most cases, to reduce, as an example, to reduce the amount of traditional wayfinding in the building, because the buildings quite literally help you to understand the way in which you might move around those spaces, through that building. That happens in a number of different ways, in very conscious ways. But one of them comes out of that conversation about movement and the choreography of movement that we were having just a second ago. Understanding buildings as less an amalgam of discrete programmatic entities, and much more as an experiential and to some extent choreographed set of relationships in the building, produces a different way of approaching that problem of complexity, spatial complexity, I think, in the building. In our buildings, I think what you would hopefully find is that the gestural qualities of the building are not there just for sculptural purposes, but are there really, in many ways, to be in a more direct conversation with you, the building user, in a more one-to-one conversation with you, both physically, intellectually, conceptually, temporally, and that by doing that, by understanding that the buildings are only understood in many ways, that the relationships in the buildings are only understood, only become provocative by the fact of you, the building user, the building goer, the building inhabitant, being in that one-to-one conversation. I think if you start from that point, generally, you don't need to mask the inadequacies of the building and its confusion through many of those other more graphic needs. So I think we are thinking about that. I think that is a part of not just the question of pragmatics of moving around the building, but is also very much about the culture of the experience of the building. And you? Dana?
So much of the work, as you describe it, is characterized by these extensions of either the natural world or the urban realm, kind of cuts across or relates across the project site. And in the case of, like, for example, Pittman or Carver, where they're bound forms as buildings, I couldn't help, I was thinking a lot, looking at Pittman, about the Lautner, for example, the hexagonal truss single-family houses. And I was wondering, in the case of those bound forms, if there are either opportunities or efficiencies that came up structurally or mechanically that you could talk about.
I think
or even programmatically, like there has to be an efficiency to a bound form.
well, in Pittman, in some ways because houses are more singular things, that was not so specifically the issue. Although I think one of the things about Pittman, and it gets a little bit at the last question, one of the things that a number of people who've been to the building really, that house have remarked on, is that on the one hand, the house seems very compact from the exterior. And it is. It's not a very large house. But that as you move through the building, as you experience that house, it seems like a significantly larger house, experientially. That in a way, the building, even though it's very dense and compacted, your experience unfolds. It is almost as if you have this long, linear set of iconic moments, experientially perspectival moments, that then gets more deeply intertwined. But that's less about the kind of more pragmatic efficiencies you're talking about. I do think in projects like Carver, that's something that we have struggled with in all of the Skid Row projects. One of the issues in those projects is the question of cost and trying to produce not just the most significant amount of architectural intention on those budgets, but also to try to find ways that those buildings do not feel completely internalized, where the inhabitants don't feel completely separated and marginalized from each other. Those buildings have as one of their goals the ambition of being a kind of machine for connecting individuals to, at the very least, a semi-public ability, because they become quite privatized living out on the street all the time. And if you're that public all of the time, almost all of the people coming off who are homeless develop incredibly internalized lives, because it's the only way of separating themselves in a sense from that publicness. In that project, or in those projects, we're trying to create spaces that, for instance, don't have the efficiency of a double-loaded corridor, very pragmatic, a double-loaded corridor, but are instead a single-loaded corridor, because it means that every time you come out of your apartment, you're a part of a collective, even if it's just in the courtyard. That produces significantly more exterior space or exterior surface area, which is more expensive. So in a project like Carver, one of the early goals of producing that round shape was an experiment to see what form could produce the smallest amount of surface area with the greatest amount of internal square footage. And the round form really began to do that. So it's the compaction, the density, the pragmatics of that started from that. I think that in the later projects, though, in projects like Pirelli, the project in Shenzhen, project in Fresno, which I didn't show tonight, you begin to see that the relationship in those projects of structure, the environmental capacities for the building are trying to be intertwined with another idea of internal social internal social life. And so those spaces, which are in many ways very pragmatic, come from specific engineering goals, are also asked to carry additional conceptual capacity to try to produce another kind of connective space, social space within the buildings. And I think maybe that's a thread which we'd have to spend more time exploring, but I think that there is this thread in all of this question of urbanism between the pragmatic, the prosaic, the direct, and the political, the social, the aspirational in these projects, and how those are deeply intertwined, so that all of those goals are not singular. They're not even trying to do two things, but in many ways, each one has a kind of tripleness to it in terms of its intention.
I was just wondering, this is a specific question, in terms for the Neutra House edition. I was
Sometimes, I think, you find forms that are catalysts, that may begin a process or begin an idea. And I think often metaphor or analogy is important because in the early moments of a design, at that point, we were talking about this in the studio today, at that point when an idea, a concept is new, it's also extremely fragile and doesn't have the full breadth of an entire project and processes thinking to support it. And metaphor very often at that point, analogy, creates a kind of armature or prop for those ideas that allows them to support themselves for a while, because you can say, I'm trying to do this, I think this is about this, it has some relationship to this other form out in the world, and that other form, or the new form, can borrow some of the legitimacy of that other metaphor to bring it along. Often, that metaphor becomes less distinct, that original prop becomes less distinct and starts to fade back more into the body of the design as a whole. In a project like Pittman, where those dissections relate so specifically then to the final design. It's not that it's not manipulated some, it is. But in that, there was such a direct idea about how those planimetric geometries could potentially take, again, that psychological, the psychology of transparency on the exterior, cut it apart and fold it in so that psychology began to live a very different life on the inside of the form. And the inside became the outside. There was this inversion that I thought not only was that that idea and that geometry was so abstract that you could never really say that you were going to have to develop that diagrammatically into something which had spatial, visual, form, aspirations. It would change so significantly in its realization that I was interested in whether that armature of an idea could still actually be readable and present. When you're in the buildings, and that's the thing about that project which is different. When I talked about transposition before, about the fact that you maybe in these buildings see the context and see the buildings from very different places, and it changes your perception of it. In that project, when you're in the building, I'm not sure you ever read that diagram. I think you read the ambition of what that metaphor, that analogy was trying to produce. You read the transparency. You understand, I think, this idea about simultaneity and the psychology of that, and how distinct and transformative that is from more typical typologies of house. It's not until you actually walk up the hill and you're at the Neutra house where the diagram becomes much more visible. And at that point, I don't think the diagram is about the house, the Pittman house specifically. That diagram at that point is really caught in the conversation, is the mediating element, is really the connective element between the Neutra house and this new thing, and the carpet of single-family houses out in that far perspective. And because of that, I don't think that's diagrammatic at all as well. That the metaphor somehow changes and takes on, like an armature, the complexities of what surrounds it.
Well, I think your process of operation is, on one hand, very extremely formal, but also very pedagogical. So there's a level of exploring new opportunities intellectually, always in the process of generating. I wonder that kind of practice could bring you closer to the university's influence towards the city, not only from its formal influence, and obviously the quantity of it, but also the debate on how city can reform it around the university forces, both formally and intellectually. I want you to address that.
Well, I hope that that's a significant part of the conversation that we begin with this studio, with the seminar, and with this studio. I've talked some about Los Angeles, and I've talked about the contemporary city. But I think the most important thing about Los Angeles, in many ways, when we think of it urbanistically, when we begin to address it or approach it urbanistically, is that this city in particular has the capacity, I think, to be an extraordinary laboratory for thinking about urbanism, thinking about questions about the city that don't just relate to this place. I think have real pertinence, have real credibility for other emerging contemporary cities as well. And because I'm interested in the fact that USC, that very few, as much of a laboratory urbanistically as this city is, there have been very few conversations about what that means, what urbanism means in this city, that have challenged in the most progressive, most optimistic, most contemporary ways our assumptions of urbanism as a whole. And I think partially that's because architecture in this city has very much not only been focused on its role as a continuing ongoing place of development for modernism and ideas about modernism, primarily through the house. But it's also been a culture that has produced great invention as it relates to the formal qualities and the formal language of architecture. But I do think that the city is at a point where it is once again changing quite significantly. I think there are pressures on how we imagine the urbanism, what we imagine this city urbanistically. I believe those pressures are developing in such a way that the city will inevitably change again, as it has reinvented itself in many different ways. And I think that one of the most important questions for certainly a university that's in the center of what was historically the city, and now is very much at the epicenter of the rewriting of the city as it becomes denser, is at the complex crossroads of a series of infrastructures, both existing, inherited, and developing. All things characteristic of a city like Los Angeles. That it's important to try to find a way to produce models, progressive models, that drive that conversation and that debate forward. And I don't know of that many other forums in Los Angeles, in many cities, but in Los Angeles, to have that kind of debate if it's not in the academy, if it's not being sponsored in some way by a kind of culture that has as its mandate questioning and debate.
Well, I certainly hope that debate should not only stay in the classroom. Through many of you here practicing in the city so aggressively, come around the classroom and really bring the energy throughout the campus into the city. And it's probably highly hopeful that maybe a new time will come that architects that with critical thinking actually do, through their practice, influence the campus, influence the city beyond the campus. If that could be achieved, I think that LA, with new architects in LA emerging, it really would make the cut and the most prime cut in the history, in the genealogy of, I can't even pronounce that word, of the architectural scene. Obviously, let me encourage applause for Michael's generosity.